Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first exclusive Facebook Live for the CBT Resources for Therapists group. If you're out there watching, feel free to give me a shout out and say hi. Ask any questions that you might have. I'll be checking over periodically and do my best to answer them. And, bear with me while I get used to this Facebook Live format. My second time doing it. So this is a little exposure for me. So that's what we're here talking about today. We are talking about the top 10 mistakes that therapists make delivering exposure and response prevention and how you can keep from making those mistakes in your practice and better help your patients, your clients. So why is this topic important? Really, over the past several years, the more research that's been done on effective treatments for anxiety, we have really been seeing that exposure and response prevention is the effective component in most anxiety treatments. It's really, really important when you deliver exposure to deliver it correctly if you want to be able to really optimally help your clients and reduce their anxiety. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today, is common mistakes that people make when they deliver exposure that reduce its effectiveness. So I would say the number one mistake that people make is not selling it effectively. If you think about it, what you're asking people to do when you do exposure therapy with them is to face their worst fears. And if you don't give people a really, really good rationale for why you're asking them to do that, they're not going to buy it. They're going to say no, right? They're going to opt for, treatment as usual. And what I mean by selling it, right, you want to be able to explain a thorough rationale for what's maintaining their anxiety and specifically hit it why exposure and response prevention, is the real true way to target those thoughts and feelings. Another mistake I think that people make when just they're initially selling exposure and response prevention is sort of underplaying it, playing into biases like, oh, well, there's this treatment, but it's really awful. And no, throw that out. Like, there's this treatment and it's really amazing. There's this incredible effective treatment that we have for your anxiety, and I'm going to tell you all about it. I'm super excited to share about it with you. So before you even go into the exposure component, make sure that you've got your pitch ready and that it's effective. Practice delivering it, to your friends, to your colleagues. Number two, pressure to complete in 12 sessions. So this is something that I hear really commonly, both from clients coming in and from therapists, maybe who weren't necessarily trained with a cognitive behavioral theoretical orientation, that there's all of this pressure, the research studies and the manuals say that I should be able to deliver exposure in 12 sessions. But the reality of that is a little bit different. So you might notice, and probably one of the biggest kind of criticisms that's leveled at exposure therapy is the high dropout rate in treatment studies. And what I've noticed, if you talk to practitioners who do this not in a research study, but in a way where they're able to tailor the experience to their clients, where you're allowing your client to go at their own pace, I really don't have people drop out of exposure. And I think that has a large part to do with me not pushing them through just because it's possible to get it done in 12 sessions. Very much go at your own pace, meet your client where they're at. This is about delivering effective treatment, not pushing them through as quickly as possible. Number three, fragilizing our clients and colluding with their avoidance. So I think fragilizing is one of my favorite concepts that I got out of working for a couple of years on a DBT team, right? And it's the idea that we sort of expect our clients to be fragile, to break easily. And we then collude with their avoidance, right? We agree, okay, with that, you're right, that's way too scary for you to do. And this includes, not encouraging our clients to complete their exposure therapy assignments outside of session, which is so important for progress, right? It's great if they make progress in session, but, they're not going to move into your office. So unless that's going to happen, where they really need to make progress is doing their homework outside of session in their natural environment. And in order to do that, we can't fragilize our clients. We have to believe that they are capable of learning to not avoid these things that are making them so anxious. Number 4, focusing on the exposure part at the expense of the response prevention part, right? So we call it exposure therapy kind of for short, but it's EXRP, right? It's exposure and response prevention. In order for the exposure to be effective, you cannot neglect to address the response prevention. So let's say somebody has a spider phobia and they're engaging in avoidance behaviors and certain safety behaviors, like always carrying Klonopin in their purse every time they go on a hike, or asking friends and family members to check rooms for them, right? Those are the responses, the safety behaviors that you need to address in addition to exposing them to the thing that they're afraid of. If you don't address those responses, the person will never believe that they are actually in a safe situation. They're just going to continue to believe that their responses, right, their safety behaviors are the things that are keeping them safe. And that's going to maintain the anxiety over the long term. It's not going to be a complete treatment. So do not neglect, excuse me, the response prevention. Number 5, believing that anxiety has to go down during the exposure in order for it to be effective. And this is something I think that goes back to the early days of exposure therapy when that was a thing. That was how people were taught, was that in order for it to be an effective exposure, you need for the anxiety to peak and for the anxiety to go down. But what we know now more recently is that you actually don't need for the anxiety to go down in that moment in order for effective exposure and response prevention treatment to take place. And you'll learn the more you do it. Some folks, their anxiety goes down in minutes. Others, it might take hours, and it might be completely impractical to continue to hold a session with them, you know, for the hours that it might take for their anxiety to go down. So great, now we know that that is not a necessary component of an effective exposure session. The necessary component is tolerating the anxiety without engaging in the anxiety reducing response. All right. Number 6, restructuring and reassuring during the exposure. So I love cognitive restructuring. I do it all the time, but in the midst of an exposure session, that is not the time to engage in cognitive restructuring or reassurance, providing reassurance to your clients. And this, I think, is a particularly tough thing for us to do as therapists, right? We, I think, are naturally empathic people. I felt empathy towards my robot vacuum earlier today because I was eating pizza and it was cleaning my house, and I felt really bad. And I like to think that my fellow therapists were drawn to this field because we feel empathy and we want to help people. And while you're doing an exposure, you will encounter incredibly high levels of distress. Because like I pointed out in the beginning, right, you are asking someone to literally face their worst fears and to tolerate their anxiety and to not do the things that they may have been doing for years to get through. And so that's going to naturally pull us as therapists to want to give them a little relief, right? To want to say, okay, no, it's okay. You're really, I promise there's absolutely nothing that you can get from this toilet seat. And what you have to remember and what you have to stay strong in is that in that moment, that is doing your client a disservice. And that hopefully when you are selling your treatment and providing them with psychoeducation, this is something that you actually addressed that you would not be providing. And it's something, I like to throw out there to my clients. I'm not trying to be cruel. I know that the most helpful thing right now for you is not to provide the reassurance and not to actively try to make you feel better and try to make this go away. Number 7, failing to differentiate between anxiety and disgust and not explaining the difference to clients in terms of how they respond to treatment. This, I think, is actually one of my favorites. I'm not quite sure why. I think a lot of it has come out of the more recent body dysmorphic disorder literature, but I think it can also apply to phobias and OCD. A lot of times, let's just take OCD for example and say that you have somebody with contamination OCD who's excessively worried about dirt and germs. There's probably a great deal of anxiety there. But in all likelihood, there's also disgust, right? So there's just something about it that's icky, that's gross. And the thing is, us humans, we habituate to anxiety, but we don't habituate to disgust. So it is not likely that their feelings of disgust are going to go away in the same way that their feelings of anxiety will lessen over time and that they will feel safer. So I think, one, it's important to assess disgust as separate from anxiety, give people a little psychoeducation so that you can manage their expectations, so that they don't think that they're not getting better, that their anxiety isn't improving because their disgust isn't improving. And the task there is really to learn to tolerate the disgust, because the levels of disgust will not change, but the anxiety absolutely will. Number 8, not getting training because you think doing exposure and response prevention is super simple. It's a very straightforward sounding treatment. But one of the things that I hope to impress upon people, through this group and throughout my work, is that CBT, right, cognitive behavioral therapy, isn't just a set of interventions. It's a theoretical orientation, and there are theoretical underpinnings that, if learned and applied properly, will help you to do much more effective exposure. So, if you haven't been trained in CBT, go out, get some training in exposure and response prevention. It's fun to learn. Believe it or not, it can actually be fun to deliver. There's a lot of opportunity for creativity. But both, don't underestimate the need to get extra training and supervision, and don't be afraid to ask for it, because we went to graduate school for a limited amount of time. You can't get trained in everything, and there are always new opportunities to learn and add things to your practice. Number 9, not dealing with or being aware of kind of your own feelings that doing exposure might bring up. And I'm going to give you an example from a long, long time ago. I was doing exposure therapy for somebody with a dog phobia, and we were handling really, really small puppies. And during the exposure, one of the puppies bit me and broke the skin on my hands. Now, we're talking teeny, teeny, tiny puppy, minuscule little kind of prick on my hand. And because I know that it wasn't the pain or the fear of the dog, it was the thought of the germs that potentially, this unknown dog had transmitted to me, that was getting to me. And I'm aware of that, right? Because I've thought through what makes me anxious, what can I tolerate, what can't I tolerate. And because I was able to really monitor my responses, because believe me, in that moment, all I wanted to do was drop that dog, run over to the people responsible for it, and say, okay, can somebody please tell me when the last time this dog was vaccinated, and I need to clean out this teeny tiny minuscule wound. And I was able to sit with the anxiety, hold it. It wasn't apparent. And it actually became a really great learning moment for the person that I was doing exposure with, that, look, kind of the worst thing happened. She was able to see the dog bit me. I did say ouch, mostly because I was startled, and because I'm a human being, and it was okay. And she was able to see that we all made it through that. However, had I not been aware of my own concerns about germs, I could have probably very easily reacted in a very kind of unproductive way and not modeled coping behavior for her, which is ultimately, when you're participating in an exposure with a client, you want to model coping behavior. And there are a number of ways to address this. I think the first thing is, not everybody has to do all types of exposures. If you don't feel comfortable driving with somebody who has panic disorder, who might have a full-blown panic attack while you were in the passenger seat with them, that is okay. There is no judgment. If you don't think you can keep your emotions in check and you're going to feel incredibly fearful while you're doing this, you don't have to do that type of work. You can think about, okay, what are the types of fears and phobias that I feel most comfortable working with? And you know what? If I get a driving case, I'm going to refer that to somebody else. Otherwise, just be aware of your own reactions. I'm constantly monitoring myself to see if I'm giving off excessive signs of seeming nervous or anxious in situations. where you might encounter dirt and germs and things like that, because that's my hot button. And as a last note, some appropriately modulated self-disclosure, if you're comfortable with that, is not a bad thing. So I think clients often benefit, when we're processing the exposure afterwards, to hear from their therapist, yeah, like, I didn't love touching that toilet, right? Nobody loves touching a toilet, and you can join together in that way. Finally, number 10, not going far enough in the exposures. So here is how I want you to think of your client's ability to tolerate anxiety when they're coming to you with a fear or phobia or OCD, panic disorder. And I don't know if any of you had braces when you were younger, but if you did, you'll remember those teeny tiny little rubber bands that they would make you wear. And right when you first got them on, if you tried to open your mouth too quickly, they would snap. You can still kind of feel that pain of them snapping, right? And that's basically your client's fear, is that rubber band. It is just wound really, really tightly. And the idea behind exposure is we're trying to expand that rubber band way beyond what a typical person might encounter in, a day, a week, or a month, so that they snap back in a more flexible place. And so what I mean by that is, at the top of exposure hierarchies, you might have things like sticking your hand inside of a toilet, and naturally your client is going to look at you and say, who would ever do that? I'm never going to need to do that. And they are absolutely correct. And I will tell them that, well, most likely they're absolutely correct, although you do never know. I did once, kind of in an odd, ironic twist of events, drop a ring into a toilet of an OCD clinic that I did want to retrieve, and I did have to stick my hand in there. But 9 times out of 10, you're not really going to have to stick your hands in a toilet on a regular basis. But there is a method to the madness, right? It's so that you snap back in a more flexible place. As I've been doing this for a number of years, I've also realized that there are other reasons to do that kind of above and beyond work that at first blush seems a little unreasonable. And that's because you never actually know what you're going to encounter in this world. And your job is to prepare your clients to go out and live their best possible lives. And the way that I think about phobias, fears, OCD, panic disorder, they make people's lives smaller and smaller and smaller. So I want to give people the confidence to go out there and believe that if a toilet is exploding in their face, they will be able to go on and live their lives. And those are the 10 most common mistakes that therapists make when delivering exposure and response prevention, at least as I see them. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. We can wait around a couple of minutes and see if anybody does. And of course, this will now be available forever in the CBT for Anxiety Resources for Therapists group, so you can post any comments or questions below at any time, and I'll do my best to get back to you quickly. And thank you for everyone who joined me tonight. Have a good night.